Trading rarely collapses because of flawed indicators or weak strategies. The real destruction almost always begins the moment a trader stops being themselves and mutates into a reactive, impulsive, emotionally hijacked version of who they were at the start of the session. And if you think back to the worst day you ever experienced in the markets, you'll notice that it wasn't a world-shaking news event or a violent overnight gap that ruined you, but the internal chain reaction that ignited inside your mind after a sequence of losses slowly eroded your cognitive stability. Because one loss is manageable, two losses are irritating, but three or four losses in a row begin cracking the mental framework that keeps you grounded until something snaps and you abandon structure, logic, patience, and discipline, morphing into a frantic, distressed version of yourself who revenge trades, doubles size, disobeys every rule you ever wrote, takes impulsive setups you'd never consider on a normal day, and shifts from trading the market to fighting it, desperately trying to erase the emotional wound your ego interprets as a threat to your identity. And this psychological breakdown, this complete collapse of rational decision-making, is what traders call tilt, a dangerous mental state borrowed from poker, where players implode after bad beats, except in trading. The consequences are magnified because financial markets punish emotional behavior with ruthless mathematical precision. And what makes tilt particularly deceptive is that it convinces you that you're being productive because you're clicking buttons, scanning charts, entering trades, telling yourself you're taking action, when in truth you've lost access to your rational faculties as your brain shifts into primal survival mode, redirecting blood flow away from your analytical centers and into emotional circuitry designed to protect early humans from predators, rather than navigate probability-driven environments like modern markets where logic is the real currency of survival. And once tilt begins, once your neurochemistry shifts into this reactive state, your expected value collapses instantly, because a disciplined trader operating inside a system may have a positive expectancy, but a tilted trader experiences a deeply negative one as trade selection degenerates, risk explodes, analysis evaporates, and emotional impulses take full control, making it possible to destroy in a single hour what took months or years to build, since losses no longer feel statistical or neutral, but personal, like direct insults to your competence, your intelligence, your identity. And once losses feel personal, your thinking brain shuts down, transferring full authority to the part of your mind that only cares about eliminating the perceived threat, not following rules or respecting risk, which is why traders can literally watch themselves breaking every rule they created, yet remain powerless to stop, trapped inside their own body, as if observing from the outside, while their emotional brain, now in the driver's seat, steers them deeper into the spiral. Because the harder they try to force control, the deeper they sink into emotional quicksand. And this is precisely why discipline and willpower alone cannot protect you from tilt. Since willpower is a finite resource, and emotions are ancient, powerful, and biologically engineered to override rationality whenever a threat, real or imagined, is detected, making tilt not a mindset issue, but a physiological one, which is why traders need rigid, mechanical, non-negotiable systems that do not care how they feel, do not rely on them being strong, and do not trust them to make rational decisions when emotional circuits are activated. Systems that function like guardrails on a fog-covered mountain road, preventing them from driving off the cliff when visibility disappears. And one of the foundational pillars of such a system is mandatory position size reduction after a predefined number of consecutive losses. Because losses destabilize your emotional baseline, and the reflexive instinct of a tilted trader is always to increase size to make it back, which is the single most destructive decision in all of trading. So the system must enforce automatic size reduction, not as a suggestion, not as a flexible guideline, but as a law, stating that after 2 or 3 losses, your size is cut by half or more, no debates, no exceptions, no emotional bargaining, because the small cost of missing potential upside on the recovery trade is trivial compared to the catastrophic cost of a full tilt meltdown. And another critical rule is a strict cap on the number of trades you are allowed to execute per day or week, because tilt thrives on frantic overtrading, on the desperate compulsion to keep pushing buttons to reclaim emotional equilibrium, and a hard trade limit shuts that compulsion down by eliminating the possibility of infinite impulsive entries, protecting you from the blindness that emerges during loss-chasing mode. And complementing these is the most important circuit breaker of all, the maximum daily loss limit, which forces your trading session to end the moment you hit a predetermined financial threshold, guaranteeing that your worst day stays survivable and never escalates into a career-ending catastrophe. And these rules cannot be flexible or subjective, because the moment you treat them as optional is the moment tilt finds its opening to slip through the cracks and take control. And the uncomfortable truth is that traders who avoid tilt are not the ones with exceptional intelligence or discipline, but the ones who refuse to leave anything to emotional chance, who understand that trusting their brain under stress is like trusting a storm to stay gentle, and so they design environments where dangerous moments are predetermined, contained, and neutralized long before emotions enter the picture. And understanding tilt also requires understanding your personal psychological triggers, the internal and external factors that make you vulnerable. Because tilt is not random, it is predictable, and its seeds are planted long before the meltdown occurs, starting with losing streaks, especially those that feel unfair or statistically improbable, because consecutive losses gradually increase psychological tension until the emotional threshold shatters. Unexpected losses on trades that looked perfect, which can trigger a sense of injustice and disbelief that accelerates emotional volatility. Technical glitches that produce oversized losses and shock the nervous system. Long winning streaks that inflate confidence and make the inevitable next loss feel catastrophic. Missing major market moves that produce guilt and FOMO. External stress from relationships, finances, health, deadlines, or sleep deprivation that loads your nervous system before the session begins. And the quiet frustration that accumulates on days where the market is slow, choppy, or uncooperative. And once these triggers accumulate above a certain threshold, tilt follows a predictable psychological pattern where losses feel personal, the ego feels wounded, the brain detects a threat, the amygdala takes over, cortisol floods the system, the analytical mind shuts down, emotional impulses spike, risk tolerance inflates, decision-making collapses, and the trader enters a downward spiral where each bad decision reinforces the next, and this cycle continues until something stops it. Either a blown account, a platform restriction, or the trader physically stepping away. But professional traders never rely on those emergency stops because they build systems that prevent the spiral from starting in the first place by embedding rules that activate at the earliest signs of emotional deviation. And to make these systems effective, traders must automate or externalize the constraints whenever possible using broker settings, scripts, limiters, alarms, or dashboards, because relying on mental reminders during tilt is as ineffective as whispering instructions into a hurricane. And in addition to these structural guardrails, traders must keep a detailed journal, tracking not only trade logic and outcomes, but rule compliance, because over time the journal reveals an unmistakable truth. Profitability is directly correlated with adherence to rules, not market intelligence or charting skill. And traders who internalize this truth eventually recognize that surviving tilt has nothing to do with being mentally superior, and everything to do with building an architecture that assumes you will sometimes be mentally compromised, creating a trading identity that does not depend on heroic discipline, but on systems strong enough to protect you from yourself. And this acceptance is what transforms trading from an emotional war into a procedural craft where the system handles danger and your only job is to follow it, which is precisely why systematic traders outperform discretionary emotional traders in the long run. not because they predict better, but because they avoid catastrophic days. Because the real game in trading is not maximizing peak performance, but eliminating catastrophic performance, since a single disaster day can erase months of progress. And the traders who last long enough to compound over years are those who engineer systems that eliminate the possibility of catastrophic days entirely, understanding that trading is not a test of brilliance, but a test of survival. And the traders who win are the ones who build strategies designed not merely to generate returns, but to defend them, who trust their systems more than their impulses, and who respect the psychological dangers of tilt enough to construct environments where tilt never gets the opportunity to manifest, because the greatest threat in trading is not the market, but the trader's own emotional brain. And once you finally accept that your emotional brain is the true adversary, not the market, not the strategy, not the volatility, you begin to see trading through an entirely different lens. Because the real battle has never been against external price movement, but against the internal forces that twist your perception, distort your judgment, and push you into destructive behaviors when your psychological thresholds are exceeded. And when this realization sinks in deeply, you stop trying to become some mythical, perfectly disciplined trader, and instead start designing a trading environment that makes discipline unnecessary, because the true professional does not depend on emotional strength to save them. They depend on systems so airtight that even in their weakest emotional moments, even when frustration, anger, panic, or desperation flare up, the system absorbs the chaos and prevents it from translating into financial damage. And the more you internalize this reality, the more you recognize that tilt is not just a random emotional event, but a predictable physiological pattern rooted in survival mechanisms that evolved long before financial markets existed, making the human brain fundamentally unfit to handle modern trading environments without structural support. Because financial losses trigger the same neural pathways that once responded to life-threatening danger, causing the body to produce stress hormones that shut down rational decision-making, narrow focus, heighten impulsivity, and drive the organism into fight or flight mode. And while this response is beneficial when escaping predators, it is catastrophic when interacting with markets, where survival depends entirely on calm, probabilistic reasoning and the deeply negative expected value of decisions made under emotional hijacking. Explains why tilt produces disproportionate damage, why a trader can destroy months or years of progress in a single afternoon, because each tilt-driven decision compounds the emotional pressure, and each emotional decision further degrades the quality of judgment until the trader is no longer seeking opportunities, but seeking psychological relief, trying desperately to erase the emotional pain of loss rather than follow a rational process. And this shift transforms the trader's intention from executing a strategy to defending their ego. And once your ego becomes the decision maker, your account becomes the sacrifice, which is why systematic traders remove ego from the equation entirely by embedding rules that leave no room for emotional bargaining, rules that automatically shrink size during loss streaks, halt trading at predetermined drawdown thresholds, enforce mandatory timeouts after emotional triggers, and eliminate the possibility of unlimited trade entries. Because every unnecessary decision you eliminate is one less doorway through which tilt can enter. And when your trading process gradually evolves into a systemized routine governed by predetermined conditions rather than real-time emotion-driven choices, you begin to experience consistency, not as a fleeting illusion, but as a structural inevitability. Because your system becomes the gatekeeper that prevents your worst impulses from ever reaching your trading account. And as time passes and you trade under this protective framework, something remarkable begins to happen. Your emotional reactivity slowly diminishes because your brain learns through repeated experience that losses are no longer existential threats, that bad days no longer spiral out of control, that losing streaks no longer end in disaster, and then a new kind of psychological stability emerges, one that cannot be achieved through motivational quotes or mindset exercises, but only through actual protective structure, because the nervous system only learns safety through repeated experience of safety. And your system gives you that experience every time it prevents a meltdown, trains your brain that the market cannot hurt you the way it used to, and gradually rewires your emotional patterns until tilt triggers become weaker, shorter, and less frequent. And this rewiring fundamentally transforms your relationship with trading. Because the noise inside your mind quiets, the urgency fades, the fear softens, the desperation disappears, and trading becomes a calm, measured execution of probabilities rather than an emotional battlefield, allowing your analytical mind, not your emotional brain, to dominate the process for the first time. And as your emotional turbulence subsides, your clarity increases, your timing improves, your selectivity sharpens, and your decision-making becomes more consistent, not because you suddenly became smarter, but because you finally removed the internal chaos that once clouded every choice. And with this new clarity, you begin to notice things you previously missed. Subtle market shifts, cleaner entry points, smarter exits, and better risk allocation, because your mind is no longer drowning in emotional noise. And this new clarity enables you to act with patience instead of urgency, discipline instead of panic, and logic instead of fear. And this behavioral transformation marks the moment you begin evolving from a struggling trader into a stable, consistent, long-term operator. Because trading success was never about predicting markets or mastering complex strategies. It was always about eliminating the emotional spikes that lead to catastrophic decisions. And once those spikes are contained, growth becomes almost mathematically inevitable, because your bad days remain small, your average days remain stable, your good days compound, and your entire trading identity shifts from chaotic and reactive to controlled and deliberate. And as this controlled identity becomes your default, you become the kind of trader who can survive any environment: volatile markets, slow markets, frustrating markets, because your survival no longer depends on your emotional state, but on your system's structure. And this structural resilience becomes your competitive advantage in an arena where most traders are constantly battling themselves, repeatedly blowing up, burning out, or abandoning their process after emotional spirals. But you do not spiral anymore, because your system catches you before you fall. And this catching mechanism gives you something priceless: longevity. The ability to stay in the game while others self-destruct, to remain consistent while others oscillate between euphoria and despair. And longevity is the single greatest predictor of trading success, because the longer you remain stable, the more opportunities you encounter, the more data you collect, the more experience you accumulate, and the more compounding works in your favor, creating a virtuous cycle where stability feeds experience, experience feeds confidence, confidence feeds clarity, and clarity feeds better execution. And better execution reinforces your stability, forming a loop that strengthens over time until your trading skill becomes a natural expression of your systematic environment rather than something you must force through willpower. And eventually you reach a point where tilt becomes almost unthinkable. Not because you're immune to emotion, but because your system is so strong and so deeply integrated into your process that your emotions never get the chance to damage you the way they once did. And this is when trading transforms from draining and stressful into sustainable and even enjoyable. Because the emotional pain that once overshadowed the experience disappears, replaced by a calm, steady confidence born from knowing that you are protected, guided, and supported by the structure you built. And at this stage, you realize that the real victory in trading was never outsmarting the market, but outsmarting your emotional brain, never eliminating fear, but eliminating fear's power to influence your actions, never suppressing tilt, but preventing tilt from ever taking control. And this final realization reshapes your entire understanding of what trading actually is. Not a quest to dominate markets, but a process of engineering an environment where your worst self can no longer sabotage your best self, where your biological limitations are neutralized, where your emotional storms cannot sink your boat, and where your edge can finally flourish unimpeded, turning trading from a fragile pursuit into a durable path toward long-term mastery, stability, and growth. And as this durable path takes shape beneath your feet, you begin to understand that every truly successful trader in history, whether systematic, discretionary, fundamental, or technical, eventually discovered the same truth you are now living, that the enemy was never the volatility, never the chart patterns, never the economic landscape, but the unprotected mind of the trader navigating it. And once you finally engineer that protection, once you build a system that shields you from the emotional storms that once hijacked your decisions, trading stops being a chaotic struggle and becomes a steady ascent, where each month builds on the last, each year compounds on the previous, and each decision fits into a larger framework designed for longevity rather than short-term emotional relief. And this long-term orientation changes the way you interact with the market at every level, because when you are no longer desperate to win today, when your identity no longer hinges on the outcome of a single trade or a single session, you gain access to a level of patience that most traders never experience. A patience that allows you to ignore mediocre setups, avoid emotional trades, and wait for only the cleanest, highest quality opportunities, because you are no longer fighting the market to repair emotional wounds, but working with your system to extract statistical edges over time. And this patience produces a new kind of confidence, not the fragile ego-based confidence that evaporates after one loss, but the stable, grounded confidence that comes from structural protection, emotional neutrality, and consistent execution. And this confidence allows you to see the market in a way that reactive traders cannot, noticing the rhythm beneath the surface, understanding when to engage and when to step back, recognizing that sometimes the best trade is no trade, and realizing that consistency is created not by doing more, but by doing less of the wrong things. And as you engage in this refined way, you begin to view losses not as failures, but as necessary components of the statistical game, as routine fluctuations that hold no emotional weight. And once losses lose their emotional power, your mind stops trying to avoid them through desperate measures, allowing your system to run smoothly, even during drawdowns, because you understand that drawdowns are the unavoidable cost of participating in probabilistic environments, and that your system already accounts for them through risk parameters, size adjustments, and protective rules that ensure a drawdown cannot become a disaster. And this understanding liberates you from the psychological tension that once defined your trading experience, freeing you to focus on long-term execution rather than short-term emotional relief. And this liberation deepens your emotional resilience because you no longer perceive trading outcomes as reflections of your worth, but as data flowing through a structured process, removing the ego from the equation entirely. And once the ego is removed, tilt loses its primary fuel source because ego-driven trading thrives on attachment. Attachment to being right, attachment to avoiding losses, attachment to proving something, attachment to recovering quickly. But when your identity is no longer threatened by outcomes, none of these attachments survive, and trading becomes clean, objective, and procedural, allowing your system to operate without emotional interference. And in this procedural state, you begin refining your strategy from a place of clarity rather than desperation, making thoughtful adjustments based on data rather than emotional reactions, gradually evolving your edge over time as you learn, test, and iterate. Each improvement stacking on top of a foundation of stability, creating a long-term upward trajectory that grows stronger each year. And as your process matures, you begin to understand why so many traders fail, not because they lack skill, but because they never survived long enough for their skill to compound. Because trading rewards longevity more than brilliance, and the only way to achieve longevity is to prevent the catastrophic actions that cut careers short. And this prevention is precisely what your system now guarantees, ensuring that you remain in the game year after year, unaffected by the psychological traps that wipe out others. And the longer you stay in the game, the more your experience compounds into wisdom, the more your discipline evolves into instinct, the more your strategy becomes an extension of your thinking, and the more your results reflect not momentary emotional fluctuations, but long-term structural consistency. And eventually, you reach a point where your trading feels effortless, not because it is easy, but because you have removed the friction that once made it hard, the emotional friction, the psychological friction, the internal conflict between logic and fear. And once that internal conflict is gone, what remains is pure execution, pure observation, pure alignment between your rational mind and your trading actions. And this alignment is the essence of mastery, the state in which your system and your psychology operate in perfect synchronization, allowing you to execute consistently without emotional turbulence. Because your rules absorb the turbulence, your system neutralizes the chaos, and your mind is free to operate calmly inside the protective boundaries you constructed. And as this state becomes your new normal, you begin to appreciate the depth of your transformation, not just as a trader, but as a thinker, as a decision maker, as an operator in uncertainty, because you have learned to do something that most people never achieve in any domain. You have learned to control the environment around your decisions so thoroughly that your emotional brain no longer has the power to sabotage you. And this control extends beyond trading into your approach to risk, patience, discipline, and long-term thinking in every area of your life. Because once you master the ability to separate emotion from execution, you unlock a capability that transcends markets, a capability that allows you to navigate uncertainty with clarity instead of fear, with discipline instead of impulse, with structure instead of chaos. And this capability compounds, just like your trading account, creating a parallel upward trajectory in your psychological stability, your decision-making quality, and your overall confidence in handling complex situations. Because once you have built a system strong enough to protect you from your darkest impulses in trading, you begin applying the same thinking to other areas of your life, habits, work, health, relationships, realizing that environment, structure, and pre-commitment are far more powerful than raw willpower, and that consistency in any domain depends not on emotional strength, but on the design of the systems that guide your behavior. And this realization leads to a profound shift in the way you view yourself, because you no longer see your past failures as proof of weakness, but as proof of insufficient structure. And once structure replaces willpower, your self-belief grows because you now understand that you don't need to become superhuman to succeed. You simply need to build systems strong enough to compensate for being human, and this perspective strips away the shame, guilt, and self-doubt that once clouded your mind, replacing them with clarity, self-respect, and confidence. Not because your emotions disappeared, but because they no longer define your actions. And when emotions no longer control your actions, trading becomes not a psychological battle, but a statistical journey. One in which your system carries the weight, your rules carry the discipline, and your mind carries the calm certainty that no matter how the market behaves, your worst possible day is contained, your emotional storms are neutralized, and your long-term growth is inevitable as long as you continue to respect the architecture that protects you from tilt. The silent destroyer that once ruled your decisions, but now exists only as a distant memory of who you used to be before you became a systematic operator. Someone who no longer fights the market, but flows with it. Someone who no longer collapses under emotional pressure, but executes through it. Someone who no longer fears their impulses because their system shields them from those impulses, allowing you to step confidently into the long-term path of real trading mastery, where surviving is winning, protecting is compounding, and systemization is freedom. And as this mastery deepens, you begin to realize that the true essence of trading was never about discovering the perfect entry, timing the perfect exit, or predicting the next market move, but about engineering a personal environment where the worst version of you, the impulsive, emotional, reactive self, never gets the chance to touch your account again. And this realization crystallizes into a kind of inner peace that very few traders ever reach, because once you know with absolute certainty that your system protects you from catastrophic behavior, the anxiety that once accompanied every trade evaporates, replaced by a calm, steady patience that allows you to wait for clean setups without pressure, act decisively without hesitation, and walk away without regret. Because you finally understand that your job isn't to control the market, but to control the conditions under which you participate in it. And when you control those conditions, the market has no power over your emotional state, no ability to push you into panic, no leverage to provoke you into revenge trading, because your emotional brain is no longer part of the decision-making process during danger zones. And this psychological distance gives you access to a level of objectivity that dramatically increases your edge, allowing you to see charts without bias, evaluate setups without attachment, and execute trades without fear, because you know that your system already contains the worst-case scenario, the maximum you can lose, the limits of your exposure, and the boundaries of your risk. And this containment frees you from the emotional burden of trying to prevent ruin in real time, because ruin has already been prevented structurally, mathematically, and procedurally before you even click the button, turning trading from a reactive struggle into a structured routine. And as your structured routine becomes second nature, you start to notice that the chaotic emotional swings that once defined your trading journey no longer affect you, because the magnitude of your losses is capped, the frequency of your trades is controlled, the size of your risk is reduced during vulnerability, and the system automatically corrects your behavior long before emotions can escalate into disaster. And in this controlled environment, your account begins to grow steadily, your drawdowns begin to flatten, your confidence becomes more grounded, and your decisions become more consistent, not because you are immune to emotion, but because emotion no longer translates into behavior. And when emotion no longer translates into behavior, tilt loses its claws completely, and you become the kind of trader who can survive anything: flash crashes, volatility spikes, extended drawdowns, long periods of uncertainty, because your survival does not depend on perfect execution, but on the strength of the system supporting you. And this strength gives you something priceless: time, the time required for your edge to manifest, the time required for your skills to mature, the time required for compounding to work its quiet magic, because trading edge is meaningless without time, and time is only granted to those who avoid catastrophic decisions, those who survive the psychological traps that end most trading careers early, those who resist the temptation to trade emotionally, and those who build systems strong enough to carry them through the darkest moments of uncertainty. And as you continue along this path of sustainable, stable growth, you begin to reflect on the trader you used to be, the one who chased every move, who panicked at every loss, who tilted after a few setbacks, who blew up accounts trying to recover emotionally, who treated trading like a battlefield instead of a statistical craft. And you recognize that the real transformation wasn't in your strategy or your technical knowledge, but in the removal of chaos from your internal world, the containment of your impulses, the neutralization of your survival instincts, and the emergence of a calm, structured, methodical trading identity that no longer treats markets as enemies, but as environments to navigate. And in this navigation, you discover that the real joy of trading comes not from the thrill of winning, but from the peace of consistency, the satisfaction of process, the confidence of knowing that no matter what the market does, your system has already protected your future. And this understanding becomes the foundation upon which true mastery is built. Because mastery is not perfection. Mastery is protection. Mastery is containment. Mastery is the elimination of catastrophic outcomes. And once the catastrophic outcomes are eliminated, the upward progression of your trading becomes a simple matter of time, experience, and incremental refinement. And as this upward progression continues, your emotional brain, the same brain that once hijacked your actions, gradually learns that trading is no longer a threat. And when it learns this, the intensity of your emotional responses continues to fade, until one day you realize that you are no longer triggered by losses, no longer seduced by impulsive entries, no longer tempted by revenge trades, because the emotional architecture that fueled those behaviors has been dissolved through repetition of safe, structured experiences. And this dissolution leaves behind a version of yourself who operates with clarity even under pressure, who maintains equilibrium even during volatility, who waits patiently even when the market is chaotic, and who executes decisively once conditions align, embodying the rare combination of calmness and precision that defines elite traders across all eras. And once this state becomes your permanent operating mode, your entire relationship with uncertainty changes, because uncertainty no longer frightens you. It becomes the field in which your system thrives, the environment where your discipline stands out, the arena where the emotional majority self-destructs while you survive, persist, and grow. And survival becomes your edge. Persistence becomes your advantage, and growth becomes your destiny. Because the market has always rewarded those who can stay in the game long enough to extract its opportunities without being destroyed by its randomness, and by eliminating tilt from your trading environment, you have achieved the single greatest accomplishment a trader can aspire to. You have removed the one force capable of ending your career in a single day, your own unprotected emotions. And in doing so, you have transformed trading from a perilous roller coaster into a stable, scalable long-term craft, governed not by adrenaline but by structure, not by impulse but by process, not by hope but by probability. And this transformation ensures that your account, your mind, and your future remain protected as you move forward, compounding your edge year after year, knowing that the darkest parts of your psychology can no longer sabotage the brightest parts of your potential, because you have built a system strong enough to shield you from yourself. And in that protection lies the true path to consistent profitability, long-term mastery, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a trader who no longer fears the market because they have mastered the only thing that ever truly needed mastering, their own mind.